For the introduction. And I want to talk about pollination. But first, maybe a little bit of an introduction. That's right. Introduction. So, that's my name. I've been working since I started as a trainee with Peter Seed in 1990 in California. From there, I moved to production, some production research. I started focusing on manual hybrids, everything manually hybridized. Moved to stock seed for Solanaceous and Brassica, the worldwide management of these parent lines. I did product development for Andina North. That's Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela. Forget anything? No, that's about it. And in which I actually worked together with Alexandra. And after that, I became the research trial manager for South America, where you basically work closely with breeding and you decide in which areas we're going to trial which portfolio. It has a lot to do with adaptability. My function after that, the most recent function, global crop specialist for Brassica. That's production specialist. So I don't know if that makes me a specialist. I sure know that I've made all the mistakes one can make in any of these functions. So, but you learn from your mistakes. That's a bit about me. I'd like to know a little bit about you, if you wouldn't mind. Anyone involved with breeding? Okay. Anyone involved with production research? Okay, that's quite a few more. Actual seed production? Okay, more or less. All right. Product development? Okay, that's pretty uncharted territory then for this area. Well, that's good. That's good. That's good. Okay, so I started, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I started emasculating and pollinating in the field, doing it myself, week after week, hurting knees, hurting back. And then I thought, okay, now I understand why manual pollinated hybrids are so expensive. So I started experimenting with some tetrazolium dyes, because I figured if I'm working all day long in the field and applying this pollen, do I work with actual good pollen? Do I apply enough? Do I apply it at the right time? Or are we just pollinating because we need to be pollinating? So I started experimenting with tetrazolium dyes, test membranes and pollen grain in vitro culture to see if I could get pollen grains to germinate, pollen tube growth. The whole thing actually raised more questions than it gave me answers. And at that time, there was no Google search bar in which I could look up things, so that kind of dates me. But I was looking for answers. If you have pollen tube growth, you pollinate in the afternoon. Right temperatures drop. Will pollen tube growth slow down and pick up again in the morning, or is all my effort lost? I've also figured that nature's design is pollen abundance. And what we're trying to do, at least what I was trying to do in the manual hybrids, was something very contrary to what nature does. What does nature do? Nature, through its pollinators, wind, insects, it works within an environment with a wide range of pollen viability, a wide range of stigma receptivity, and you need both to actually set seed. What do we do in manual hybrids? We emasculate. That's pretty drastic. Then we limit the number of flowers on the plant. We apply pollen only once, and then we hope that it sets seed. But it's only a one-time shot that we get. Some plants you pollinate many more flowers, but it's very limited, very restricted if you compare that to what nature's design originally was. So I became convinced that the seed business is the pollination business. And at one point during my training period, my supervisor said, so how do you like this? I said, yeah, but I'm not the seed business. I'm in the pollination business. So he said, okay, that makes sense. Maybe we have been approaching pollination as trying to kill a mosquito with a shotgun. And that gave the idea within the organization I worked to start production research. That term didn't exist yet in the organization, but the idea was like, let's figure out why we are doing what we're doing. Do we understand why we do certain things? Oftentimes I got the answer, well, we've been doing this for 30 years. That's not an answer. And that's also not the way to move forward and make progress. So I started color tagging manually pollinated crops, see if I could relate pollination efforts to seed set, to abortion rates, to final seed yields. We got some interesting results, qualitative in nature, and of course, to be able to get some funding for specific things, you need really tangible results. So we lacked that quantitative dimension. Plus the assumption that all our experiments in the field were done with a reasonable pollen quality. We had no ways of really measuring pollen quality because it was way too cumbersome. There was a tremendous time delay and all that. So the conviction started to emerge that we need to be actively managing pollination rather than just kind of letting it happen and see what seed we get X amount of time after pollination. So I became convinced that solid data on pollen quality, it can explain part of the variability. You all know the variability in yield in, I'm talking vegetable crops here, is tremendous. Yeah, some crops it can go from anywhere from 10 to 200%. We'll get to that later. Yeah, but 30% up or down is very reasonable, right? So we have a lot of variability. Pollen quality explains part of it. If I can reduce the variability of those results, I increase the predictability of my efforts. And with increased predictability, I get more reliability for the business as a whole, because we can all know what to expect, and we can be reasonably comfortable. I'd like some water, actually. Is that possible? We can be reasonably comfortable that we're going to get what we're after. And that's the purpose of my presentation here today. I hope that after this presentation, you can all go home, back to the organization you work in, and thank you, Marcel, and look at pollination in a different way. And say, this is affecting us in so many ways. We really need to pay attention to this as close as we can, as much as we can. Because producing seed, half is pollen, half is male, half is the female. If we fail to put those effective together, we don't even have seed to work with. Okay, pollination impact. Customer value, size of the market. If you look at a whole, R&D and breeding, production, development, and introduction is impacted by pollination. But seed production, of course, logically. And all these things lead to seed production. Seed production, it all comes together. If we understand pollination at all levels, it'll culminate in seed production and we'll be reliable there. So, pollination, directly or indirectly, is part of a number of things. Selections made in breeding. And I'm going to touch on all these points. Product development or trialing efficacy. Variety introduction. Crop placement. Seed production and crop management. Crop estimates and even inventory, although that may seem like a far shot. Let's first talk about breeding. I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here. I'm not going to talk about double haploids, but I'm going to mention them. I'm not an expert on it. I know very little about them. Other than that, you can obtain homozygosity in a much shorter period of time compared to what you do in more conventional breeding. The Amphasys technology is very, very good, very useful in establishing and improving existing protocols. If you can take that to your breeding community, then fantastic. Then that's good. A lot of experts here, also in the room. We have several experts today. So if you want to know, if you want to build those contacts, this is the time to do it. Breeding, of course, is about new parent line development. Yeah. We need to think about the producibility of the parent line itself. Many of them are self-pollinated, for example, tomato and pepper. But then we also have kind of hybrid situations where you actually have to cross two lines to get one parent. And of course, in all that, pollination is key. If I have a fantastic hybrid, but I cannot produce the parent lines, then I have nothing. The male lines. Male lines need to be reliable pollen producers. You know, we can talk about male fitness if that's still appropriate terminology. But you need to have reliable pollen producers. Are we paying enough attention to that? Maybe not, maybe. So we could actually do, and we could use the technology, pollen testing, quality and quantity, in characterization of our parent lines. It's basically measuring the phenotypic response of the different genetics. I'll give you an example of how you could set up a trial like that, if you would want to. I hope you'd want to. You expose a set of parent lines to the exact same conditions, representative of your crop environment, of course. Keep a detailed weather record. That seems obvious. Sample early, AM, late AM, early PM. It kind of coincides with when bees normally fly. That's an indication of when everything is, receptive and viable. Repeat this daily for a duration representative of a pollination cycle. Measure pollen quality and quantity for each line and develop an index of how each responds to changing weather conditions. And if you have the resources, repeat this in key production locations. What you will get is something very similar to what many of you know as nicking trials, flowering synchronization, timing trials, which are very common already for insect and wind-pollinated crops. What you do in these is you really measure how does this line perform under certain conditions. And with what you've done before with that index, you basically say, if this line responds very strongly to changing weather conditions, it's not very adaptable. A few things can change in my environment, a sudden heat wave, a cold spell, and I have strongly reduced pollen viability. That is a risk. I've done many of these nicking and flowering trials. In brassica, it's a big chunk of what you do. And we were trying to measure pollen quantity and also quality, kind of putting it on our nail and looking at it, and it was very subjective. We had a scale from 1 to 5. And we found ourselves debating whether it was a 3 or a 3.5. That's absurd discussion because it's way too subjective. It depends on the time of day, all these things. But with pollen testing, as Amphasys is making possible, you can get a really objective and quantitative method to see how this specific parent line is reacting to the environment and how it is producing pollen under the conditions that you've placed them in. And this is a typical one of these layouts for nicking trials. It's very elaborate. It's a lot of work. It's very expensive too, these trials, depending on how you set them up. We actually overlaid this with different pruning methods, with all kinds of different things. But parent line characterization is something that's coming back frequently in this presentation, is key, and it's going to pay back. We'll get to that. So what's the output then of this parent line characterization? An indication of how adaptable material is and under which range of conditions it is likely to perform. For designated male lines, what you could do is eliminate those showing a strong response to changing weather conditions. Is that maybe 25% of the least adaptable? Well, you have to develop thresholds that are applicable to your crops, to your parent lines. That's something a breeder could be very, very helpful with, and it has to be instrumental in that, because you're going to throw things away on the criteria of being adaptable or not as a pollen producer. For the females, the seed producers, well, we don't have a way to measure seed receptivity, but still, as we said, you need to increase in them as well. So they need to have a decent amount of pollen so they can be increased. We can maintain the parent line. So reconsider continued use and see how it fits with established parent increase locations and facilities. Because usually parent increases are not done just about anywhere. We have usually tight controlled facilities. It's intellectual property. It's the gene pool that you have. So you're really careful with it. That's the germplasm. And then maybe it's not that applicable anymore, but I have seen a comeback of the concept, the feasibility of reciprocal hybrids in some crops. Anyone not familiar with reciprocal hybrid? Good, everyone's, for those in the online audience maybe, where you can harvest seeds from both the female and the male. That's it. Okay, this is not that new actually, what we're proposing here. In wheat, they have developed a pollen viability-based heat susceptibility index. It's in the literature, the HSI-PV. And it's a selection criterion for heat-tolerant genotypes. If they can do it in wheat, we can do it in vegetables. We can do it in any crop. If there is a necessity to do it in wheat, there's a necessity to do it in just about every other crop. Because we know our climate is changing. If we do this for parents, then what about the hybrids? Let's have a look. Experimental hybrid characterization. What are experimental hybrids? Breeders putting female and male together, trying to find good combinations, see if he gets good hybrids, which could potentially be interesting for the market. Include pollen testing as a screening criterion for yield stability. Well, let's talk about yield stability. We all know hot set tomatoes. Many of us know hot set tomatoes. Hot set tomatoes are characterized by the fact that their pollen viability is only moderately affected by high temperatures. That's why they're called hot set. Where non-hot set tomatoes would be wilting and dropping flowers and not having viable pollen, hot set tomatoes will still produce. Of course, there's a limit to everything, but these are typical varieties you would grow in the Imperial Valley, you would grow in the San Joaquin Valley in California, you would grow in southern Portugal, some major processing tomato areas. Hot set occurs a lot in processing, but it's something that can be incorporated. That need for hot set across crops is increasing because high day and evening temperatures are occurring more frequently. They're disturbing the pollination process, causing vegetable plants to drop flowers, and small fruits, produce deformed undersized fruits. A few examples. We've all seen this. And this is lack of pollination. Dropping flowers, abortion in a tomato, lack of proper pollination, or simply the tissue doesn't hold up. It may have pollinated, the pollen cannot germinate sufficiently, you don't have fecundation, and it's being aborted. There the pollination was successful, but not sufficient, so you get a deformed fruit. What is a way to mitigate this to a certain extent? Parthenocarpy. It's the option to ensure yield stability, bypassing the entire pollination and fertilization process. We know it for a number of crops. Breeding technology, in fact, is advancing quite actively with this, with the help of marker-assisted selection and CRISPR. And we know some of these already, these seedless crops. In courgette, cucumber, watermelon, grape, citrus, banana. It's probably not exhaustive, but these are well-known examples of parthenocarpy. So they have yield stability because they don't need pollination. Get to pre-commercial trialing. When you go to pre-commercial trialing, you now have these pre-commercial hybrids. you need to put them in different locations to see where it fits, where it doesn't fit, what's the interest. But where it fits and doesn't fit climate-wise, we already have a much better idea about because of the previous characterizations. So, we can make these trials much more efficient. We can reduce the number of trial entries. Anyone who has done this type of trial in product development knows that it can be a large number of items. We've done screenings with 400-500 different materials, and you walk through a field and you go, no, 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 yes, no, 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 yes, yes, no, 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 no. You whack out 95% at these first screening trials. But it's a lot of planting. You plant all those. What if we could reduce that initial number simply by applying the filter of pollen viability? Because we've seen in the previous slides, it's really important that both the parent lines and the resulting hybrid have pollen viability. So we get an improved match between the trial entry, the variety, and the trial location. Because we know the conditions of our location, we know what our materials require, what their limits are, and we can make a better match. And of course, we then have an increased probability of finding something that's superior to what we already have in our portfolio. And the criteria that I use to manage that in terms of yield, because basically all our crop improvement in vegetables is about yield. If it doesn't yield 20-25% better than what we have in the existing portfolio, it's not worth advancing. Growers are not going to change their varieties. A known variety they've grown for 6, 7, 8 years sometimes, they're not going to change that right around from one year to the other based on a few trials we do and in which it shows 10% increase. You'll plant a few and the change is slow. So it needs to be a convincing difference. And you can make the probability bigger by pre-selecting on pollen viability in your pre-commercial trialing. All the steps to this point, they are actually a direct investment in a steeper learning curve. What was one of the biggest obstacles we would face in product development? You now have selected an interesting material, and all of a sudden everyone wants seed. You want bigger trials, and you want it in more locations. The sales organization is starting to jump up and down. We want seed, we want seed. Oh, sorry, we only have 50 grams available for the next 2 years. Sorry, guys. Conference calls and you name it. But you only have 50 grams, and it takes time to make more seed. So being able to create seed, to be able to know how to create seed, how to grow that new variety, requires a learning curve. And the steeper it is, the better it is, because you go faster. So we're investing, with all the previous things we've discussed, in an early and steep learning curve. Yeah? We go through different steps: breeding selections, pre-commercial selection, commercial introduction, first commercial crop, and just for the sake of argument, I put in a third commercial crop. And you can see, and this is a general depiction, you know, don't nail me on the exact percentages or whatever it is, but the general trend is this. This is the most common scenario, the blue one, because if we're not investing in characterization early on, for example, applying this pollen viability filter, yeah, we start learning about the producibility of a variety when we really need to start growing seed on a larger scale. And then we are behind. What this steep learning curve gives us, it's a reduced seed supply risk. I'm still talking about a reduced risk. We still don't know exactly what to do in the very beginning, but we're learning. We're learning early on, yeah, for both new parent material and for the new semi-commercial materials. See, it's the wrong button. Yep, okay, what does this do? This is crucial for any product developed scenario. The best way to kill a promising variety is not have seed to hand out, to put in trials, to put with growers. You can have the best variety in the world, well, that's maybe exaggerated, but you can have a really promising variety, and growers have seen on a small scale, for example, a tomato grower. You've seen 100 plants in a trial. Was invited to a field day. They thought, oh, that's nice. Gee, very interesting. I'd like to have 2,000 plants in a section of my greenhouse this coming cycle. Sorry, Mr. Grower, we won't have seed until 1.5 years from now. Wah, wah, wah. That really kills the variety. We've seen it happen so many times. It's not because of lack of promise, it's because of lack of seed for the variety. Then the effect of material characterization on the number of advanced materials. See this as a funnel without characterization. Now we have a different funnel, a funnel with characterization. You see, the same goes in the top, but much less comes out at the bottom, because with the same throughput, but a better defined output. What does it give us? Advancements to commercial. What do I need for commercial? It's a rapid increase in required seed volumes, as was just described. Here comes our learning curve. Our characterization improves our producibility and thus the reliability of the seed supply, and we can do this. We can provide the seed volumes needed for effective advancement in the market. Crop placement. Well, I think I'm trying to open a door that's open already. Everybody knows this. The first step towards reliable seed supply is the right crop in the right place at the right time. Well, crop placement is a headache. It's a tremendous headache. And if it was only as simple as this in practice, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But as a seed company, you have a limited number of production locations. You're competing for space, competing for means, competing for labor. Cost is often a consideration on where you're going to place something. How loud sales is screaming is really a factor to take into account, and rightfully so, because they want to bring it to the market and sell it. So what's happening in practice? Let's first look at the low volume items. What are the low volume items? We'll get to that, but what you look at these for is labor, isolation, IP protection oftentimes, because we're talking about parent increases, including bud-pollinated SI parents in brassica. Most of you have seen pollinations in pepper, tomato, in the cucurbits, and you think that's labor intensive. Try bud pollination in SI brassica parents. It's the most expensive thing I have ever grown in my life. So you really want to have that in a protected area where you can really control things. Yeah. Seed of experimental hybrids for continued trialing are usually grown in areas where you can control it. Early pre-commercial hybrids. A designated company-owned or tightly controlled facility is usually chosen for these productions. And you want to minimize the seed supply risk because you want to have control over the whole set of conditions. Yeah, and you also choose that in case of a higher degree of complexity. And that higher degree of complexity, for example, bud pollination, is pretty complex. But also these are materials early on with which we have a very limited production experience. So this allows us, having it in our own facilities, it allows us to really gain that experience, record it, and use it for the next time that we grow this particular material. Typical for what you sometimes call a home farm, this type of installation, outdoor trialing fields, etc. We talked about parent characterization in one location to begin with, and hopefully in key production locations. And it's important because we can fine-tune, it allows us to fine-tune this match between an area and the genetics that we're dealing with, the prevailing climatical conditions. So when we look at this from a point of view of crop placement, it's important that we do this characterization because we can now estimate the likelihood of getting sufficient cold hours for vernalization, right? I put almonds here in California. It's not a vegetable crop, but it's something where an entire industry is faced with climate change in a very drastic way. 90% of the California crop is planted with only 2 varieties, and 2 need vernalization. And guess what? Our winters are warming up. So what are we going to do with that almond crop? It takes, what, Mike, 5-6 years to replace it? An example. Within a location or a season, choose those cycles where you have certain conditions that are conducive to certain sections of your germplasm. Less adaptable males, for example, at the cooler onset of the season, and use hybrids that have more, that are cooler onset, and use the more adaptable males when you produce hybrids towards the area, towards the time frame where you have more risk of extreme temperatures. And of course, you can start adapting female-male ratios because you're measuring pollen quantity under a range of conditions. So maybe you have an area where you say, you know what, based on what we've observed here, and it's, again, this is an objective method to measure pollen quantity. It's not on my thumbnail and, yeah, it looks pretty good, I'll give it a 3.5. No, this is exact counts, comparable to other parent lines. Maybe there's some areas where you can grow, say, a brassica crop, not 3-to-1, you can grow it 4-to-1. Well, that's an impact in your production cost. And then, of course, crop placement is always looking at alternative or new production locations. And you can start calibrating those new sites using parent line characterization because you know what you have in your existing and well-known locations. You can place similar parent lines in a new location that you want to explore, and you can start comparing. And maybe you come to find out that your pollination season in a otherwise very interesting new location is limited to 2 or 3 weeks. Before that, it's way too cold. After that, your risk of extreme heat increases. And then instead of putting crops there, hybrids, and start producing, do all kinds of stuff and investment, you can discard a location like that because it's simply too risky. So this comes down, crop placement comes down to matching genotypes to the growing conditions optimally suited for them. And I think measuring pollen quantity becomes an increasingly valuable argument to invest in technology to do exactly this. Where do we need to grow our stuff? Our climates have changed, or weather conditions are changing so rapidly, become even more unpredictable with time, that things like IFC pollen testing, impedance flow cytometry, in combination with certain analytical tools, you've probably all heard of climate AI, combination of those can really help us hone in on areas where we should not be and where we should be. Seed production. I think I'm going to have to speed up, right? How are we? Oh, a few minutes. Okay. Seed production, of course. Now we get to seed production. Impacts on crop and ground. What can I do with pollen viability testing when I have crop and ground? Well, there's some area for immediate payback. And that's very appealing when you want to talk to production people, because the question is, well, what does it do to me? Well, this is what it can do for you. Flowering synchronization. Carrot. A pollen quantity and quality comparison between primary umbels and secondary umbels in the male can really help you adjust your pruning strategy and can tell you how much room, how much margin you have in like a carrot crop. For manual pollination, daily pollen testing to decide which maybe stored pollen source to use. if you don't have stored pollen, and we'll get to stored pollen, you're stuck with what you have that day, what you have available at the moment. Or you're going to send 200 people home because there's nothing to pollinate, or you're going to use the pollen of so-so viability. If you have stored pollen, you have a choice. And the payback there is that your manual labor is well effectively utilized. Because the same labor cost, whether you pollinate with bad quality pollen or with good quality pollen. Same labor cost. Impacts on future crop, also important. Let's say we do some daily testing to justify changes in crop yield estimates. A period with clearly below average pollen could justify that and create an early alert to planning and sales. So this is just a hypothetical, but it's kind of looking at what you have in carrot and onion, for example. So let's say we measure pollen viability over a 30-day pollination period, right? And we have the temperatures and we have the pollen viability, the green line. So that's the wrong one. Yep, this one. Okay. So if I see this, and I'm at the end of the pollination period, you know, the field rep has a portable machine in his truck, does daily measurements, and kind of creates this, right? Creates a graph like this. And he says, okay, 7 out of 30 days showed strongly decreased pollen viability. What consequences would this have? Yield estimate lowered with about 25%. But the yield estimate is at the end of the pollination period. It's a very early alert to planning and sales. And we'll see later how, especially in biannuals, that is so critically important. Sampling protocols, of course, are very important here. Can I just drive up to the crop and kind of grab something here, grab something there? It doesn't work that way. You need to establish sampling protocols. How do you establish solid sampling protocols? Again, with your pollen viability testing. You have the tool to quickly measure how certain ways of sampling affect your reading. And an example here is in sunflower. The pollen viability in the last ring of flowers is usually much higher than in the earlier rings. Yeah? So if I sample with an overrepresentation of the flowers in the last open rings, I will overestimate my actual field pollination viability, right? So careful. Protocols, sampling protocols are critical for this to work. I've talked to a whole bunch of people. I haven't worked myself a whole lot in carrot and onion other than from the product development point of view. And I've asked them, I said, if you would have a way to measure this, would you be confident to lower the yield estimate based on an observation like this? And they all said immediately, absolutely. I've never had such a good indication as something like this. Because they all know that they're difficult crops to pollinate. They go up and down anywhere, these estimates or these yields in onion can go up and down from 10 to 200%. So any early indication that they can get that something's up is important. Go to pollen storage. Of course, you have the storage hardware. But more important is to develop the storage protocol. And I know many protocols exist, and I don't think many people will be very confident to just grab a protocol from some research institute. They'd like to do it and corroborate it for themselves. So what do you have to look at? First, of course, the pollen harvest. How do you harvest pollen? Pre-storage preparation. It's not just from the flower in the fridge, goodbye. No, pre-storage preparation. Storage conditions. Pollen retrieval. It needs to re-equilibrate with the environment. Pre-use conditioning. And of course, if you're harvesting pollen several days in a row, you're going to have lots of pollen. Not lots as in much, but as in a seed lot. And just as with seed lots, you'd have to develop a way to make batches, to decide how you want to blend, if you want to blend, and if you keep a backup of your pollen. Because if something goes wrong, you have impurity in your hybrid, you want to be able to go back to the components that went into your pollen blend. So these are all things that need to be part of a storage protocol. If you have, once you have, let me put it that way, once you have a proven effective storage protocol, there are a number of very interesting things you can actually do. You can store pollen, of course, yes. You can produce during one cycle and use it in multiple cycles. Yeah, you can free up growing space. You don't have to repeat your male all the time. Yeah, and another one from a genetic purity point of view is you have a consistent male source across different crops. That would look something like this. You have a hybrid, different cycles, and you only grow the male in the first cycle, right? You grow in this would be a tomato scenario, a possible tomato pepper scenario, where for every 3 female plants, you have 1 male plant. And after that, you only plant the females, because you've stored a lot of pollen. The tomato plants are very abundant pollen producers. So you can store the pollen, and you keep using that in cycle 2 and cycle 3. Now, effectively, your multi-cycle ratio is 9. Centralized pollen management, as in pollen farms. It has a number of it's not applicable everywhere, but if you are working with small-scale hybrid seed producers, a scenario that occurs frequently in Southeast Asia, that grow the same hybrid, yeah, you can now select batches, the best viability, and provide them to your hybrid seed producers. Yeah. Another aspect, very interesting, is that not having male plants in the ground with each grower, but only the female plants, it is really providing a reduced genetic purity risk, and it helps protect your IP. Many disease resistances actually remain on the male, and it's for a good reason, because the female can be much more easily recovered afterwards from the seed that's harvested from the female. So you want to keep that, most breeders keep that on the male. So if you don't hand out the male to your growers, you're really protecting your IP. Inventory. Seems far-fetched, but it's it's a constant balancing act for the supply manager. I've seen supply managers pull out their hair because of inventory, and biannuals are very difficult to manage. Why? Well, first of all, very considerable fluctuations in yield, anywhere from 10 to 200%. We call it feast or famine, you know? It's very costly to build an extra margin on the production side. If you consistently, as a supply manager and as a production planner, say, I'm going to grow 130% of my demand because I want to make sure, you know, you're going to have a risk of having a lot of overproduction, yeah? So margin on the production side to be able to cover for lower than expected yields. Expensive oversupply and inventory situation when the crop comes in higher than expected. It's a long and costly production cycle, especially when you go from seed to bulb, bulb to seed. It's a number of years. I think Mike has a very nice calculation of how long it actually takes. He'll put some numbers on the board in terms of years, and you'll see that this difficult to respond quickly to supply interruptions is an understatement. That's an understatement. Unlike wine, bad news doesn't get better with age. If something's wrong with the crop, the sooner we know, the better. And that goes back to what we saw a few slides back on this yield estimate adjustment based on pollen viability. So early yield estimates based on pollen viability monitoring during the pollination can objectively, and this is important, objectively support decisions to put another crop in the ground somewhere else in the world. I've been in these discussions, do or do we not? It's like, well, no, I think it'll turn around. I think we'll get the seed. I think we'll get the seed. Really, what they were saying is like, we don't have the budget right now to grow another crop, and so no, we now move into the area of objective, very objective measurement. Pollination. It's all about reliability. Thank you.